Can a single child's terror define a nation for a century? Can the memory of humiliation cold and the jeering of a mob forge an instrument of power so perfect, so absolute, that it changes the very nature of a kingdom? In the year 1648, Paris was not a city of lights, but a labyrinth of barricades and fury. This was the Fronde, a brutal civil war where the nobility of France rose up against the crown. And at its heart was a boy, not yet a teenager, named Louis. He did not see grand strategy or political maneuvering. He saw his mother, the Queen Regent Anne of Austria, weeping in impotent rage. He felt the chill of the unheated Louvre Palace. He remembered, with a clarity that would burn for 60 years, the night his family fled their own capital like thieves, pursued by the scorn of their subjects. That night, something broke in the young king, and something else, cold and hard as diamond, began to form in its place. While his peers learned fencing and dance, Louis learned the art of the mask. His teacher was the cunning Cardinal Mazarin, a man who understood that power was not about armies, but about appetites. Mazarin taught the boy the three great truths of rule: trust no one, know every man's price, and understand that love is the most effective and cheapest weapon in any arsenal. A heart, Mazarin would say, is a liability, but the illusion of one is a weapon. The boy listened, he learned, he watched, he waited. Every smile from a powerful duke, every bow from a rebellious prince was catalogued in his memory not as a sign of loyalty, but as an unpaid debt of vengeance. The Fronde would eventually fail, the nobles would be pacified, but Louis never forgot. He understood that their swords were not the real threat. The real threat was their independence, their pride, their ability to whisper in their own chateau, far from his gaze. He needed to chain them, but not with iron. He would forge a new kind of chain, one made of desire, jealousy, and fear. His first experiment was on his own heart. He fell, with all the untempered passion of youth, for Mazarin's own niece, the dark-eyed, intelligent Maria Mancini. It was a genuine love, perhaps the only one of his life. For her, he was willing to defy his mother, to risk a diplomatic crisis. But Mazarin, his own mentor, delivered the final, cruelest lesson. The cardinal forbade the match. Love, he explained, was for poets. Marriage was for kings. A king's bed was not a place of pleasure, it was an instrument of statecraft. Louis was forced to choose between the woman he loved and the throne of France. He chose the throne. As Maria was exiled, she cried out, "You are a king, sire, and yet you weep." He never forgave her for seeing his tears. That day, Louis the boy died, and Louis the king, the architect of a new kind of tyranny, was born. He married his Spanish cousin, the unassuming Maria Theresa, a political pawn chosen for her dynastic value and her utter lack of threat. The marriage was a state function, a joining of bloodlines, not souls. But in the cold calculus of his new reality, Louis realized he had been given the perfect tool. A wife he did not love was not a partner, but a prop. Her humiliation could become a public spectacle, a lesson for all to see. He had learned to sacrifice his own heart for power. Now he would teach the entire nobility of France to do the same, whether they wanted to or not. He needed a stage for this grand, cruel theatre, a place where every nobleman would be a performer, every lady a potential spy, and he the sole director, a place from which there was no escape. The old palaces were filled with ghosts of rebellion. He would build his own world, a universe with himself as the sun, around which all other stars would be forced to revolve. He was no longer the frightened boy fleeing Paris. He was the master, and the lessons of the Fronde had taught him that to control his enemies, he had to bring them closer, so close they could feel the heat of his ambition and the chill of his displeasure. To control them, he first had to control their desires. The brutal lesson of his affair with Maria Mancini was a state secret he would never utter, but it became the blueprint for for his reign. What was this brutal lesson in realpolitik that Louis learned? A necessary evil that created a great king, or the tragic corruption of a soul that doomed France from the start? Tell us in the comments. The stage for this grand experiment was at first little more than a muddy hunting lodge, a place of retreat for his father, Louis the 13th. It was called Versailles. In the beginning, the court sneered. To leave the sophisticated comforts of Paris for this provincial backwater seemed a bizarre whim. They did not yet understand. Louis was not building a home, he was forging a weapon. Every ton of marble, every ounce of gold leaf was not for comfort, but for control. The palace was designed with an almost paranoid precision. Its endless corridors were echo chambers for gossip. Its vast halls had no corners in which to hide. Every room was a stage, and every courtier an unwilling actor in a play whose script was written by the king alone. In Versailles, a smile was not a sign of friendship, but a demonstration that one's teeth had not yet been poisoned. To be invited was a command. To refuse was political suicide. Soon, the entire aristocracy of France was crammed into gilded apartments, sometimes little more than closets, spending fortunes they did not have on clothes they wore once, all for a single prize, a glance from the king. And it was here, in this simmering cauldron of ambition and boredom, that Louis unleashed his first public lesson in the new currency of power. Her name was Louise de la Vallière. She was a young maid of honor to the king's sister-in-law, shy, pious, with a slight limp and a sincerity that was dangerously out of place in the nascent court. Louis, tired of the calculated affections of courtiers, was drawn to her genuine adoration. It began as a secret, a stolen glance, a whispered word. But Louis had no use for secrets that did not serve him. He decided to turn this tender affair into a public declaration of his absolute power. He showered Louise with gifts, with titles, with a love so ostentatious it could not be ignored. And he did it all under the nose of his wife, Queen Maria Theresa. The court watched, horrified and fascinated. This was not the usual discreet royal affair. This was a revolution. The king was not hiding his mistress, he was celebrating her. The ultimate humiliation came when Louis forced the queen and his mistress to ride in the same carriage. Imagine yourself in the place of the humiliated queen. What is worse, your husband's betrayal or the betrayal of an entire nation that applauds his mistress? Maria Theresa, a daughter of the proud Spanish Habsburgs, was reduced to a silent, weeping prop in her husband's theatre of power. The nobles, who might have defended her honor in a previous generation, now understood the new rules. To defend the queen was to defy the king. And to defy the king was to be cast out from the sun into the outer darkness of political and social oblivion. So they bowed, they smiled, they applauded the king's virility and the favorite's beauty. They learned their lines. Louise, who had naively dreamed of love, found herself a prisoner in the golden cage. Her conscience, deeply religious, was tormented. Her joy was poisoned by the queen's tears and the court's venomous whispers. She bore Louis illegitimate children, a brood of royal bastards whom the king, in another unprecedented move, legitimized. He was creating a new dynasty, a parallel family whose loyalty was not to France, but to him personally. They were living symbols of his power, a new aristocracy, born not of ancient bloodlines but of the royal bed. The lesson was clear and brutal. Loyalty to the old ways, to honor to the queen, was worthless. The only thing that mattered was proximity to the king's desire. Louise de la Vallière, the gentle dove, had unwittingly become the first high priestess of a new religion, the cult of the Sun King. But she was a reluctant priestess, and her sorrow was a flaw in the perfect facade Louis was constructing. The system required a favorite who would not just accept her role, but revel in it, a woman as ambitious, as ruthless, and as hungry for power as the king himself. The stage was set, the rules were established. Now all that was needed was a true star, a predator who understood that in the jungle of Versailles, love was not a sentiment, it was a strategy, for a hostile takeover. That predator had a name: Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, the Marquise de Montespan. If Louise de la Vallière was a violet, Athénaïs was a bird of paradise, beautiful, exotic, and carnivorous. Witty, intelligent, and possessed of a savage ambition that dwarfed everyone around her, she saw the position of royal mistress not as a romantic entanglement, but as the highest office in the kingdom to which a woman could aspire. She was already married, a minor inconvenience, and a close friend of the reigning favourite, Louise. This was not a barrier, it was an opportunity. With cold, calculated precision, she began her campaign. She did not seduce the king with shy glances, but with the brilliance of her mind and the sharpness of her tongue. She could match his wit, challenge his ideas, and make him laugh in a way the pious Louise never could. She made herself indispensable, not just as a lover, but as a partner in the glorious performance of monarchy. The court watched as she systematically dismantled Louise's position. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She would mock Louise's piety, imitate her limp, and console her with a viper's smile after every new humiliation. Louis, bored with Louise's tears and guilt, was utterly captivated. The transition of power was as public and as brutal as everything else at Versailles. Louise, broken and desperate, clung to her position, but she was no match for the hurricane that was Athénaïs. Finally, defeated, she fled to a Carmelite convent, trading the gilded cage of Versailles for a stone cell, seeking a peace in God that she could never find with her king. Athénaïs de Montespan's reign began, and with it, Versailles entered its most decadent, most glorious, and most dangerous era. She was not a mistress, she was an undeclared queen. Her apartments in the palace were more lavish than the queen's. She spent money with a recklessness that staggered the treasury, commissioning jewels, gowns, and palaces. Her parties were legendary, spectacles of excess that blinded Europe. She birthed 7 more of Louis's bastards, and unlike Louise, she felt no guilt. She ruled. Ministers sought her approval before approaching the king. Generals returning from war paid their respects to her first. Her word could make a duke or break a cardinal. In the court of Versailles, offending the king was a mistake, but offending Madame de Montespan was suicide. She and Louis shared a rapacious appetite for life, for power, for luxury. Theirs was a partnership built on mutual adoration and a shared contempt for the rest of humanity. Yet, even at the height of her power, Athénaïs lived in fear. She knew the king's appetites were fickle. She knew that in a world where beauty and youth were currency, she was living on borrowed time. How could she hold him? How could she bind the most powerful man in the world to her will forever? Conventional methods were not enough. In a court that was a simmering pot of ambition, one had to use every tool available. And in the shadows of the Sun King's golden palace, darker, more ancient powers were being invoked. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of love potions, of special powders mixed into the king's wine, of secret visits to fortune-tellers and alchemists in the dark alleys of Paris. The whispers spoke of a woman named Lavoisin, a purveyor of spells and poisons, who counted the highest ladies of the aristocracy among her clients. To keep the sun in its orbit, it was said, the magnificent Marquise de Montespan was trafficking with the devil himself. She was participating in the darkest of rituals, the Black Mass, sacrilegious ceremonies held over the naked bodies of women, where the blood of infants was offered to demons in exchange for power and the king's unending love. For now, they were just whispers. But a storm was gathering, a storm of poison and death that would soon break upon the glittering facade of Versailles and threaten to bring the throne itself crashing down. The storm broke in the year 1679. It began not in the perfumed chambers of Versailles, but in the stinking dungeons of Paris. The chief of the Paris police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, was a man of grim determination and incorruptible will. He was investigating a series of suspicious deaths among the aristocracy, deaths that doctors had attributed to natural causes, but that gossip attributed to inheritance powders. La Rainey's investigation led him down a rabbit hole of horror into the Parisian underworld, a secret society of poisoners, sorcerers, and disgraced priests. At its center was the woman the Whispers had named, Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin. When her web of clients was finally breached, the foundations of the French state began to shake. Her testimony and that of her accomplices, extracted under torture in the Bastille, revealed a conspiracy of breathtaking scope. For decades, the elite of France had been using her services. Husbands poisoned wives, wives poisoned husbands, heirs poisoned their parents, and rivals for courtly positions poisoned each other. The glittering court of the Sun King, it turned out, was a nest of serial killers. La Rainey created a special tribunal, the Chambre Ardente, or Burning Court, to prosecute the accused. As the arrests mounted, a wave of paranoia swept through Versailles. Who was next? Whose name would be uttered on the rack? Every great family in the kingdom seemed to be implicated. Dozens were executed or exiled. But La Rainey was not just interested in the small fry. He knew the trail of poison led higher. And finally, under extreme duress, the accused began to speak the unspeakable. They named the greatest client of all, Athénaïs de Montespan. The testimony was specific and horrifying. They described in detail how she had bought love potions from La Voisin for years to keep the king's affection. They detailed the black masses she had commissioned, with the king's mistress as the naked altar upon which the rituals were performed. They even accused her of attempting to poison her rivals, and perhaps when his eye began to wander, the king himself. Louis was faced with an impossible choice. His magnificent reign, his image as the divinely appointed ruler of the most civilized nation on earth, was about to be irrevocably stained. His own mistress, the mother of his beloved children, was being named as a sacrilegious murderer and a conspirator with demons. To put her on trial would be to admit to the world that his bed, the very center of his power, was a source of corruption and horror. To execute her would be to execute a part of himself, to confess that his glory was built on a foundation of blood and black magic. The king was trapped. What could you do? Send the mother of your children to the stake to uphold the law, or burn the evidence to save the reputation of your throne? Louis made his choice. It was the choice of an absolute monarch. The law was secondary to the state, and he was the state. He ordered the investigation halted. The key files from the interrogations, the ones that named Madame de Montespan, were brought to him personally. He threw them into the fireplace with his own hands, watching as the truth of his glorious reign turned to ash. La Voisin and her main accomplices were burned at the stake, taking their full secrets with them. But the other accused, the ones who knew too much, were not released. They were condemned to perpetual imprisonment, buried alive in remote fortresses, their names struck from all records, their existence denied. They became ghosts, silenced forever to protect the king's secret. Athénaïs de Montespan was saved from public execution, but her reign was over. The king was revolted by what he had learned. His passion turned to ice. He could no longer look at her without seeing the shadow of the devil. She was allowed to remain at court, a ghost in her own right, wandering the halls she once ruled, a living monument to the darkness that lurked just beneath the golden veneer of Versailles. The affair of the poisons was officially over, but its poison continued to seep through the court, leaving a permanent stain of fear and suspicion. The sun had been eclipsed, and everyone now knew that even the brightest light could cast the darkest of shadows. The scandal exposed the corruption at the heart of Louis's court, but was it a symptom of a broken system? Or was the system itself a perfect machine designed to breed such desperation and ruthlessness? Leave your opinion in the comments below. While the Sun King's court reeled from the poison scandal, another court, a parallel universe of intrigue and dissent, operated within its very walls. This was the domain of the king's own brother, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, known to all simply as Monsieur. If Louis was the sun, a masculine symbol of absolute power and order, Philippe was the moon, a shimmering androgynous reflection, ruling over a world of shadows, secrets, and sensual indulgence. Openly homosexual in an era that brutally punished sodomy, Monsieur was a walking paradox. He was a celebrated warrior on the battlefield, a man of proven courage, yet at court he preferred the company of his male favorites, a flamboyant clique known as the Mignons. He adorned himself with ribbons, lace, and jewels with a passion that surpassed any woman's, his face painted and powdered, his scent a cloud of perfume that announced his arrival long before he appeared. His palace, the Palais Royal in Paris, and his chateau at Saint-Cloud became the epicenters of an alternative culture, a world of lavish balls, theatrical performances, and an aesthetic of exquisite, almost painful, beauty. Louis despised his brother's lifestyle. He saw it as a source of weakness and scandal, a mockery of the virile, martial image he cultivated for the Bourbon dynasty. Yet he was forced to tolerate it. Philippe was his only brother, a son of France, and too popular to be exiled or imprisoned. So Louis controlled him as he controlled everyone else, through surveillance, manipulation, and the strategic use of marriage. He forced Philippe into two politically advantageous marriages, first to Henrietta of England, the sister of King Charles II, and then to the German Princess Elizabeth Charlotte, known as Liselotte. Both women found themselves trapped in a bizarre and often cruel ménage à trois with their husband and his all-powerful lover, the Chevalier de Lorraine. The Chevalier was handsome, arrogant, and utterly corrupt. He held a total and insidious power over Philippe, encouraging his extravagances, plundering his finances, and systematically tormenting his wives. In the world of Monsieur, political power was wielded not by ministers, but by male lovers, and state secrets were bartered for jewels and sexual favors. This shadow court became a hotbed of political intrigue. Foreign ambassadors who found their access to Louis blocked would often turn to Monsieur's circle, hoping to influence French policy through his favorites. The Chevalier de Lorraine, in particular, was suspected of being in the pay of foreign powers, a spy operating at the very heart of the royal family. The situation exploded with the sudden and mysterious death of Philippe's first wife, Henrietta. Young, intelligent, and politically astute, she had become a key diplomatic link between France and England. After a successful negotiation trip to London, she returned to France and within days died in agony after drinking a glass of chicory water. The official cause was a stomach ailment, but no one believed it. Rumors flew that she had been poisoned. The chief suspect was the Chevalier de Lorraine, who saw her growing influence over Philippe as a threat to his own. Did he act alone, or was he an agent of a foreign power seeking to sabotage the Anglo-French alliance? Or was it, as some whispered, a crime of passion ordered by a jealous lover? Louis ordered an autopsy, a rare and scandalous procedure at the time, but its results were inconclusive. The truth was buried, another dark secret in a dynasty accumulating too many of them. Monsieur's court was a necessary evil for Louis. It was a glittering sewer that allowed him to keep the kingdom's dissidents and eccentrics occupied and under his watch. But it was also a constant reminder of the chaos that lapped at the edges of his perfectly ordered world, a world of dangerous passions that could not be entirely controlled, a world where a brother's love and a lover's jealousy could alter the fate of nations. The splendor of Philippe's court was undeniable, but it was built on a foundation of borrowed money and broken hearts. This parallel world of indulgence and conspiracy was a funhouse mirror, reflecting the grand theater of Versailles, but twisting its values into a grotesque parody of power, a parody that Louis the Fourteenth could contain, but never truly erase. The era of Athénaïs de Montespan, with its glorious excesses and satanic undertones, burned itself out in the ashes of the affair of the poisons. The king, sickened by the scandal and spiritually exhausted by a life of relentless debauchery, began to crave something new. Not passion, not intellectual fireworks, but something he had never truly known: peace. The court, ever vigilant to the monarch's shifting moods, held its breath. A power vacuum had opened, and into it stepped the most unlikely candidate imaginable. Her name was Françoise d'Aubigné, the Marquise de Maintenon. She was not young, she was not a great beauty. She was not of high birth, she was a widow, the former governess to the king's illegitimate children with Madame de Montespan. In the ruthless ecosystem of Versailles, she should have been invisible. Yet this quiet, pious, and intensely intelligent woman would orchestrate the most stunning political takeover of the century. Madame de Maintenon's strategy was one of absolute patience. She did not try to seduce the king's body, but his soul. While Athénaïs offered spectacle, Françoise offered conversation. While the court offered flattery, she offered sincere, if carefully worded, advice. She became his confidant, his friend, the one person with whom he could remove the heavy mask of kingship. For a man who had lived his entire life on a public stage, this private sanctuary was an intoxicating relief. Her rise was a slow, creeping dawn that the court failed to notice until it was too late. She positioned herself as the moral compass for a king lost in a sea of sin. She spoke to him of God, of salvation, of the emptiness of worldly pleasures. She was the anti-Montespan in every way. Where Athénaïs was fire, Maintenon was water, slowly and inexorably wearing away all resistance. The psychological duel between the two women was a silent, vicious war fought in the king's private apartments. Montespan, seeing her power slip away, would rage and storm, her tantrums only serving to drive the king further into the calm harbour of Maintenon's company. It was a battle between the dying light of a supernova and the relentless gravity of a black hole. In 1683, Queen Maria Theresa died. For most of her life, she had been a phantom, a political necessity ignored and humiliated. In death, she provided Louis with an unexpected opportunity. He was now a widower, free to remarry. The court buzzed with speculation. Would he choose a German princess, a Spanish infanta? But Louis had no more need for foreign alliances sealed in the bedroom. He needed to save his soul. In a secret ceremony in the dead of night, Louis the 14th, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Christendom, married the penniless widow, the governess of his bastards. Madame de Maintenon became the morganatic, uncrowned Queen of France. The marriage was never officially announced, but it was the worst-kept secret in Europe. And with it, a revolution swept through Versailles. The age of pleasure was over. The age of piety had begun. Under Maintenon's influence, a suffocating morality descended upon the court. Balls and masks were replaced by prayer meetings and religious lectures. Low-cut dresses were forbidden. Libertines and atheists who had thrived under Montespan were now forced into public acts of repentance or sent into exile. Could you imagine the whiplash? To go from a court of open debauchery to one where missing Mass was a political crime. Versailles, once the world capital of sin, now resembled a monastery. Madame de Maintenon herself never took the title of queen. She remained in the shadows, her official position unchanged. But her power was absolute. She was the gatekeeper to the king. Ministers, generals, even the royal children had to go through her to reach him. Her political influence was immense, shaping policy on everything from religious persecution to military appointments. She had achieved what no woman before her ever had. She had tamed the sun. She had conquered not by surrendering to the system of sexual politics, but by creating a new one based on spiritual dominion. She was the Black Widow who had devoured the decadent spider, the quiet governess who had become the iron-fisted ruler of the king's conscience, and in doing so, the secret ruler of all of France. Her reign was long and unyielding, a testament to the fact that in the theatre of Versailles, the most effective weapon was not always a beautiful body, but a brilliant, patient, and utterly ruthless mind. In the grand, brutal theatre of Versailles, human beings were instruments, and none were more ruthlessly used than the king's own children. Louis the Fourteenth, obsessed with the continuity of his dynasty, treated his offspring, both legitimate and illegitimate, as assets on a political chessboard. They were not sons and daughters to be loved, but pawns to be sacrificed for the security and glory of the House of Bourbon. The heir factory, as the court cynically dubbed the royal nursery, produced a steady stream of princes and princesses destined for lives of gilded misery. The fate of the royal daughters was perhaps the most straightforwardly tragic. They were raised for a single purpose, to be bartered in marriage to secure a foreign alliance. Shipped off to Spain, Savoy, or Bavaria, often as mere children, they faced hostile courts, unfaithful husbands, and a lifetime of homesickness, their letters back to their father filled with a pathos he largely ignored. Their duty was to produce heirs for foreign thrones, and many died in childbirth, their diplomatic purpose served. For the sons and grandsons the cage was of a different design, but no less cruel. The Grand Dauphin, Louis's only legitimate son to survive to adulthood, lived his entire life in the shadow of his titanic father. Crushed by the king's expectations and given no real power or responsibility, he lapsed into a state of indolent apathy, his court at Meudon a lackluster echo of the splendors of Versailles. He was a king in waiting who would never rule, dying of smallpox before his father. The king's obsession with his own bloodline led him to the unprecedented and scandalous decision to legitimize his bastards by Louise de la Vallière and, especially, Athénaïs de Montespan. He showered them with titles, wealth, and honors, elevating them to the rank of princes of the blood. This act drove a poisoned wedge into the heart of the royal family. The legitimate branches of the house, the Orléans and the Condés, were forced to accept these children of adultery as their equals, a humiliation that bred deep and lasting resentment. Louis then took his dynastic engineering a step further, forcing his legitimate family members to marry his illegitimate children. His own nephew, the future regent Philippe d'Orléans, was compelled to marry one of the king's daughters by Montespan. It was a union he considered so degrading that he openly flaunted his lovers and his contempt for his wife. The court became a snake pit of familial hatred. Brothers intrigued against sisters, cousins against nephews. The king's bastards, led by the brilliant and ambitious Duke of Maine, formed a powerful clique, constantly jockeying for power against the legitimate princes. They were a testament to the king's will, a living embodiment of the principle that his desire superseded all laws of God and man. The human cost of this policy was staggering. The court was rife with tales of forced weddings where the bride or groom fainted at the altar, of secret abortions to conceal forbidden liaisons, of young princes drinking themselves into early graves out of boredom and despair. These children, born to the pinnacle of power, were prisoners of their own blood. They had every luxury except the one they craved most, the freedom to choose their own life, their own love, their own destiny. They were the ultimate victims of the system Louis had created. He had demanded absolute obedience from his nobles, and he demanded it even more absolutely from his own flesh and blood. Their broken lives and tragic ends were, to him, merely collateral damage in the glorious construction of his own immortality. The great monument of his reign was built not only of stone and gold, but of the sacrificed happiness of his own children. History often judges a ruler by their heirs. Was Louis's ruthless use of his children a brilliant stroke of dynastic strategy that secured the Bourbon line, or a monstrous act of personal vanity that sowed the seeds of future discord? Share your verdict in the comments. In the ecosystem of Versailles, where the king was the sun and his mistress the reigning planet, there was another often forgotten class of victim, the husbands. For a nobleman of 17th century France, honor was everything, and the ultimate dishonor was to be a cuckold. Yet the system Louis created demanded precisely that. To have one's wife chosen as the king's lover was, paradoxically, both a source of supreme humiliation and the greatest possible political opportunity. A man's career, his family's fortune, and his social standing could be made by tacitly accepting his own shame. Most husbands chose the path of quiet compliance. They would be conveniently sent to command a remote garrison, or dispatched on a long diplomatic mission, or simply paid off with a governorship and a title. They would avert their eyes, swallow their pride, and reap the rewards that flowed from their wife's position in the royal bed. They became the army of cuckolds, figures of public ridicule in the salons of Paris, but men of immense influence within the golden cage of Versailles. They were a walking, breathing testament to the new reality that even a man's honor was a commodity to be traded for royal favor. But there was one man who refused to play the game. One husband who chose rebellion over riches. His name was Louis-Henri de Pardaillon de Gondrin, the Marquis de Montespan, the husband of the great Athénaïs. The Marquis was a proud, eccentric, and hot-tempered Gascon who genuinely loved his wife. When she became the king's mistress, he did not react with quiet submission. He reacted with theatrical, incandescent rage. His rebellion was a public performance of defiance, a direct challenge not just to the king, but to the entire unspoken contract of Versailles. He arrived at court in a carriage draped entirely in black, drawn by black horses. When asked who had died, he announced to the astonished courtiers that he was in mourning for his wife, who was, for him, well and truly dead. He then added enormous branching horns to the roof of his carriage, a universally understood symbol of the cuckold, and drove it brazenly through the streets of Saint-Germain. He held a mock funeral for his dead wife. He confronted the king's ministers. He made a scene wherever he went, refusing to be silenced, refusing to be bought. Imagine the sheer audacity. In a world of absolute monarchy, one man dared to publicly mock the king for stealing his wife. Louis the Fourteenth, who demanded total control, was utterly flummoxed and infuriated by this one man he could not silence. The Marquis's rebellion was a crack in the perfect, polished facade of his power. He could not execute the man without admitting to his own adultery and making the scandal even worse. So he tried other methods. He had the Marquis imprisoned in the Bastille. He had him exiled to his remote estates in the south of France. He had him threatened, cajoled, and offered immense bribes, but the Marquis would not yield. For years he continued his one-man war against the system. His defiance became a legend, a source of secret amusement for a court that was too terrified to voice its own resentments. In the end, however, no individual could win against the absolute power of the state. Worn down by years of exile, his fortune ruined, his spirit finally broken, the Marquis de Montespan eventually capitulated. He accepted a massive payment and agreed to live quietly, a ghost haunting the edges of the world he had once defied. His story is a tragicomedy, a tale of a man who tried to cling to an old-world concept of honor in a new world where honor had been replaced by ambition. He was the exception that proved the rule. His spectacular failure served as a potent warning to any other husband who might consider defying the king's desires. The system had to break him to demonstrate its own resilience. The army of cuckolds learned its lesson. In Versailles, a wife was the most valuable political asset a man could have, but only if he was willing to sell her. The silence of these men was the quiet, grinding sound of the great machine of Versailles, a machine that ran on sacrificed pride and commodified love. The sun must inevitably set. For decades, Louis the Fourteenth had seemed immortal, a force of nature as constant and as brilliant as the celestial body he had chosen for his emblem. But by the turn of the 18th century, the sun was clearly in its twilight. The king who had danced and ridden to war with inexhaustible energy was now an old man, racked with the painful and undignified ailments of age. The god was becoming mortal, and the court, that predatory organism, could smell the blood in the water. The final years of the reign were a slow, grim procession of decay. a public performance of suffering that was in its own way as theatrical as the great balls of his youth. The king was afflicted with gout, with boils, with a perpetual fistula that required a terrifying and public surgery performed before the horrified eyes of his courtiers. The operation was a success, and a hymn was composed in its honor, but the message was clear: the king's body was failing. He lost his teeth, and his legendary appetite gave way to digestive miseries. He was eventually diagnosed with gangrene in his leg, a creeping death that filled the perfumed halls of Versailles with the stench of decay. In an era before modern medicine, his final decline was an agonizing spectacle, yet to the very end he refused to surrender the performance of kingship. Each morning was the ritual of the levee, the royal awakening, where he would be dressed and groomed in front of an audience of nobles, even as his flesh was rotting away. He was determined to be the sun until his very last breath. But as his physical power waned, a far more terrifying decay was consuming his dynasty. A series of sudden, devastating deaths swept through the royal family, almost as if the House of Bourbon had been cursed. In the space of just 11 months, from 1711 to 1712, death claimed his son the Grand Dauphin, then his grandson the Duke of Burgundy, and the Duke's beloved wife, and finally their eldest son. A single outbreak of measles had wiped out 3 generations of heirs. The court was plunged into a state of shock and paranoia. Was it truly disease, or was it poison? The old ghosts of the La Voisin affair stirred again. Suspicion fell upon the king's nephew, Philippe d'Orléans, who stood to gain immense power if the direct line failed. Though no evidence was ever found, the stain of rumor clung to him. The kingdom was left with a single, fragile heir. The king's great-grandson, a sickly toddler who would one day become Louis the 15th. The throne of the most powerful nation in Europe rested on the flickering life of one small child. A desperate, silent war for the future erupted in the corridors of Versailles. The court split into factions. On one side were the king's legitimized bastards, led by the Duke of Maine, who had been granted immense power in the king's will. On the other was the Duke of Orléans, who, as the closest legitimate blood relative, believed the regency was his by right. The final years were a race against time, with conspirators holding secret meetings, attempting to bribe ministers, and trying to influence the dying king to alter his will in their favor. Louis, in his agony, watched the vultures circle his throne, knowing that the perfectly ordered world he had spent a lifetime building was about to be torn apart by the very ambitions he had so carefully cultivated. The setting of the sun was not a peaceful twilight, but a violent, stormy dusk filled with the stench of sickness and the whispers of conspiracy. The golden cage was becoming a tomb, and its prisoners were simply waiting for the zookeeper to die so they could tear each other to pieces. The end came on the 1st of September, 1715. After 72 years on the throne, the longest reign of any major monarch in European history, the Sun King was dead. As the news spread, a strange mood settled over France. There was official mourning, of course, but beneath it, there was a palpable sense of release, even celebration. The nation was exhausted by endless wars, crippling taxes, and the suffocating piety of the king's later years. They were eager for a change, and a change they got. The king's meticulously crafted will, designed to secure power for his beloved bastard son, the Duke of Maine, lasted less than 24 hours. The moment the old monarch's breath was gone, his nephew, Philippe d'Orléans, marched into the Parlement of Paris and had the will nullified. The king's final act of control was brushed aside with contemptuous ease. The system of absolute monarchy, which seemed so intrinsically tied to the person of Louis the 14th, immediately began to fracture. The era of the regency began, and it was a direct and deliberate repudiation of everything the Sun King had stood for. The court abandoned the gilded prison of Versailles and rushed back to the pleasures of Paris. the suffocating piety of Madame de Maintenon was replaced by an explosion of open debauchery, financial speculation, and political chaos that made the era of Montespan look tame. The aristocracy, which Louis had so successfully domesticated and turned into decorative lapdogs, proved utterly incapable of governing. Raised for generations on a diet of intrigue, gossip, and the pursuit of royal favor, they had lost the habit of responsibility. They knew how to scheme for a place in the king's carriage, but they had no idea how to run a country. The legacy of Versailles was a ruling class that was politically neutered, morally bankrupt, and dangerously disconnected from the people of France. The very tool that Louis had used to control the nobility, the golden cage, had also destroyed them, leaving the nation leaderless and adrift. The chasm between the glittering elite and the suffering populace grew wider and more toxic with each passing year. The scandals that Louis had used as instruments of power, public mistresses, legitimized bastards, financial excess, became, under his less capable successors, Louis the XV and Louis the XVI, symbols of the regime's incompetence and decay. The magnificent theatre of power that Louis built became a caricature of itself, a hollow spectacle that no longer inspired awe, but contempt. The seeds of revolution were sown in the soil of Versailles. The cynicism, the inequality, the belief that power was a game played by a privileged few for their own pleasure. These were the lessons the French people learned by watching their monarchs for a century. When the time came, they would take those lessons to heart. The guillotine that fell upon the neck of Louis XVI in the Place de la Révolution was, in a very real sense, the final piece of machinery in the great political engine that his great-great-grandfather had designed. Louis the Fourteenth built an eternal monument to his own power, but the very system that ensured his absolute control also guaranteed the eventual destruction of his dynasty. What was the true nature of the Sun King's legacy? A masterpiece of political engineering that held a nation together and made it the envy of the world, or a beautiful but poisonous machine that guaranteed its own destruction by institutionalizing corruption? The debate rages on. Share your verdict below.